What is the worst bug type Pokemon? Now, you probably think that the reason why this question is interesting is because bug is pretty widely agreed upon as the single worst type in the game. However, that's actually not what makes this question interesting. Because yes, while it is true that bug is the worst type, in more recent generations, Game Freak appears to have been actually trying when they made their bug types. And I would say that they've actually done a very good job. So good, in fact, that there is only one bug type Pokemon on this top 10 list that is from Generation 5 or later. 9 of the Pokemon here are from Generation 4 and before. Now, as always with the series, I want to preface by saying that I'm only talking about how good or bad these Pokemon are from a competitive lens. I'm not talking about design, I'm not talking about how, iconic they are. I'm only talking about how good they are competitively. And for the vast majority of these Pokemon, they have actually 0 competitive results. So for this list, I'm going to be ranking these Pokemon based on how easy or hard it would be to use them in the official competitive format. We're going to start from the least bad bug type and work our way up to the most bad. So coming in at number 10 is Beedrill. Beedrill is not a very good Pokemon. Bug and Poison are both not especially good offensive types. In fact, they're both pretty mediocre offensive types, especially Bug. But defensively, it's actually not a bad combination. However, the issue with Beedrill there's a lot of issues, but I would say the biggest one is the stats. Beedrill is one of the first Pokemon you encounter during a playthrough of Generation 1, and as such, the stats are not made to be, an especially good Pokemon in a competitive format. It's pretty much just a Pokemon here that evolves early to get you through the early game and kind of introduce you to the concept of evolution early on. So I don't think it's wrong that Beedrill has pretty terrible stats, but yeah, they're really bad. I was gonna say the biggest issue is the fact that it's not very strong, but honestly, all of the issues are big. It is supremely frail. The defense stat is almost unspeakably awful. Base 40 is that is not usable. And it's also actually quite slow despite being a bee that flies around, and also not very strong. Now, to compensate for this, its move pool also doesn't really give it any good tools. Actually, that's not entirely fair. Beedrill does have a couple good coverage moves. So the biggest question here is, why is Beedrill not higher up on the list? Why is it only number 10, right? And the reason is very simple, which is that Mega Beedrill exists. And on the one hand, it's true that Mega Beedrill is not a good Mega evolution. Even though it gets a ton of speed and attack, it's still so frail that it ends up being more of a liability than anything else. And that's a big part of the reason why Mega Beedrill has 0 documented results, though I'm sure that somebody used it at some point. It was never recorded, at least. But if you compare Mega Beedrill's stats to any other Pokemon on this list, it's a lot better. And so even though Beedrill is undoubtedly one of the worst bug type Pokemon, it's not the worst. Today's video is sponsored by Hulskern. Regular viewers of this channel are likely familiar with Hulskern by now. They're a watch and jewelry brand for men and women, and I've been working with them for years. They're one of my favorite sponsors on this channel. In fact, I have worn a Hulskern watch most days of my life for years now. They're my go-to watch for everyday use. This is the one I'm wearing right now. I've been wearing this one for a while. I quite like this one. It's not really my normal style, but I don't know. This one has really grown on me. Anyway, apart from just wearing them myself, I've also given countless Hulskern products as gifts to friends and family over the years, and they're always a hit. In fact, I actually have some of their jewelry here that I've gotten as gifts for one of my editors and one of my producers. This is a nice heart-shaped necklace. My camera's all buggy, so it gets blurry when I zoom in, but wow, look at that. And then I also have this one. This is a cool, stylish necklace. Very nice. It's like a pendant. I think that's the word for this, pendant. They come in this kind of fancy packaging when you order. You have the nice wooden thing. I use these as salt cellars after I have taken my product out. But they come in these they're green, but you can't really tell because the green screen. I could fix that, but I'm not gonna. With Valentine's Day coming up, consider getting your loved ones a gift that they can wear every day. One thing that sets Hulskern apart is that all of their products are made using natural materials. If you don't know what that means, that's like wood and stone and gemstones, which means that every single thing that they make is truly unique. In fact, all products are created in small batches, which does sometimes mean that popular products will sell out quickly because, yeah, they're not mass producing these things. Each Hulskern product comes with a 2-year guarantee, and thanks to their free, express, worldwide shipping, anything you order should arrive in 3 to 5 business days. Orders placed by February 14th will also receive a free red gift satchel for Valentine's Day. If you're interested in Hulskern, you can click the link in the description and use code Wolfey for 15% off your order. Thanks again to Hulskern for sponsoring this video. Coming in at number 9 is our only representative from Generation 5 and after. And I do want to say that there are some bug type Pokemon that are not great by any means. There are a lot of bug type Pokemon that don't have a ton of results, like Leavanny, Rabsca, or Beedrill, even Pokemon like Galvantula. These Pokemon aren't very good, I would say, but they are usable in a way that the rest of the Pokemon on this list kind of aren't, if we're being direct. So as our only representative from Generation 5 and after, the 9th worst bug type Pokemon is Spidops. Spidops to me is really interesting because it comes in Scarlet and Violet, where it felt like every single Pokemon in the Scarlet and Violet Pokedex, or every single Pokemon introduced in Scarlet and Violet, had a chance to be used in some niche. Not all of them were good, but actually a lot of them saw some usage. Like a lot of them saw at least a half decent result somewhere along the way. Even Pokemon you wouldn't think of, like Bombardier, right? Which is not a very good Pokemon. Spidops is one of the only exceptions, and it's actually pretty widely agreed upon as the worst Pokemon in Generation 9, and also the 9th worst bug type, a little bit thematic there. Unlike many of the bug types that we're talking about today, Spidops actually has an ability that does something. It gets the ability Stakeout, which is a funny ability because they only seem to give it to really, really bad Pokemon. But basically the way that it works is that if a Pokemon switches in front of a Pokemon that has the ability Stakeout, that Pokemon's next attack will do double damage. So this is a really good ability because switching is quite common in competitive Pokemon. The issue is that Spidops has such terrible stats that even doubling its damage is not really that impressive. And more importantly, it doesn't pressure anything to switch out because it doesn't do anything. Spidops' biggest issue is by far the stats. I would say that its bulk is okay. Like the HP is quite low, but the defenses are fine, I would say. Not incredible, but like, I think this is also peppered by the fact that I'm comparing this to the other bug types in this list. It doesn't have the worst stats of the Pokemon that we're talking about today. They're still not very good. The big issue is the offensive stats. Like typically a Pokemon can only get away with having really bad offensive stats if it has a great supporting move pool. Spidops is slow, it doesn't really have the ability to do any damage, and it doesn't have a good supporting move pool. Some bug type Pokemon learn moves like Rage Powder and Spore and Sleep Powder. Spidops doesn't get any of that. Interestingly enough, it does get a bunch of like fighting type moves, and it kind of looks like it could be a bug and fighting type Pokemon, but it's just a pure bug type. Overall, its move pool actually isn't the worst. If it had like a lot more attack points, it could be used maybe in some circumstances. Like it gets Sucker Punch, the dark type move. It gets Knock Off, also a dark type move. It gets a couple interesting fighting moves like Circle Throw and Brick Break, but for the most part, all of its good moves are like physical attacking moves, and it just doesn't have the offense to make use of them. That being said, it still has more going for it than a lot of the bug types introduced in earlier generations, and so while it's not a good Pokemon, it's certainly a bad Pokemon, but it could be worse. Jarvis, tell the good people what it is. Bug month! That's right, it's bug month, okay? But you already knew that, didn't you? Because everybody knows about bug month. Bug themed videos every Saturday for the duration of the month. For the duration of bug month. Okay, but I have a bug month update for you, okay? Ooh, the merch, the bug month merch. Look at this. Okay, hang on. Wait, I can fix this, hang on. Okay, behold, I fixed it. Look at this design. Look at this, which sleeve is it? This one? Ooh, it's a little bug here, but that's not my favorite thing about this merch. Look at this, hang on. Can you see this? Do I have to squat? I don't really want to squat. Hang on, one sec, hang on. Okay, behold, look at that. Tell me you're not gonna buy 100, okay? And second meteor, just like Madara, ready? Behold, WolfeyVGC's Bug Canyon Company. You want 10, you want 20. You want me to be on the screen again, okay? And there's even more, okay, ready? Look at this. It's a tote bag for your groceries, for your books. Look at how chic you're gonna be. This is a unique piece of merch, okay, because it says, I'm a gamer, but I also leave my house. And maybe this doesn't apply to you, but don't you wish it would? Anyway, back to the video now, but more bug month for the rest of the month. Keep checking in for more cool bug facts. I don't know what just happened. This isn't part of the ad anymore. I just got a splitting headache. I think I've been overexposed to bug month. I think it's like staring too closely at the sun. Ow, that really hurt. Anyway, the number 8 bug type Pokemon on this list is a Pokemon I actually quite like a lot. For some reason, I actually don't know why. It's Dustox. Okay, let's talk about the good things about Dustox first. Bug and poison, like I said, is not a terrible defensive combination. You get a quadruple resistance to fighting, you're a poison type that's not weak to ground, you get a fairy resistance, like, it's not the best, but it's not the worst. You also resist a bunch of other types like bug, grass. I'm sure I'm forgetting something, poison. Also, unlike a lot of Pokemon on this list, Dustox actually has 2 pretty good abilities. Shield Dust is an ability that basically gives the holder the covert cloak item, so you can't be flinched by Fake Out, you can't be flinched by Rock Slide, Icy Wind won't drop your speed. Pretty useful across the board, and the ability Compound Eyes is actually quite good, giving you an accuracy boost on all of your moves. The issue with Compound Eyes is that Dustox actually doesn't have a lot of the higher impact, lower accuracy moves to make use of this. It gets Poison Powder, but it doesn't get Sleep Powder, so that's like the big one. And although it does learn some flying type moves, like it actually gets Tailwind for some reason. I guess it makes sense, it has wings, right? It doesn't learn Hurricane, which is the other big Compound Eyes boosting move that you would think about running at least. That being said, Shield Dust is still a great ability to have, so it's still like, it has a good ability. ability. I would say that Dustox has a lot of similar issues though to Beedrill, which is that it's an early game bug type Pokemon that like evolves early on and is intended to kind of give players an evolved Pokemon that can help with the early gyms, not to actually be useful in a competitive setting. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the big issue here is the stats. Its defense is pretty low for what it is, its HP is very low for what it is, and special defense is usable, but with a lower HP stat it's a little bit awkward, and it is slow, which is a problem, but the bigger issue here is the offense is. 50 attack and 50 special attack is like, I mean, it's unusable. These are terrible offensive stats. For context, this is 15 less special attack and like 13 less attack than Elekid, the baby Pokemon. And this is a fully evolved Pokemon we're talking about here. Basically, when a Pokemon has terrible offenses, it needs to have some good supporting moves, but despite being a Pokemon that I think should get it, Dustox does not learn Rage Powder. It's a poison and bug type Pokemon, which like seems to be giving off scales and like has poison powder. So this one I actually don't really understand. Maybe it has something to do with like the Japanese version of the name where like sometimes the moves that would make sense in English don't make sense in Japanese. The issue is basically there's nothing good for Dustox to do. I shouldn't say nothing. The reason why Dustox isn't higher up on the list is because it gets two moves that like are actually very, very good moves, even though Dustox is not a great user of them. The first I've already mentioned, it gets Tailwind, really useful for supporting your team. You could make a case that like Tailwind on a poison type in certain metas with the ability to not be flinched by, you know, Fake Out because of the Shield Dust ability, maybe this has some value. Like it's not good. There's almost always going to be better users, but like I could see somebody who's like the #1 Dustox fan finding a way of using Dustox in this specific kind of niche. The other reason why Dustox isn't lower on the list is because it actually gets access to one of the best setup moves in Quiver Dance. Now Dustox is not a good Quiver Dance user because again the stats are so bad, like the speed and the special attack are not good enough that it's worth, you know, using it as a setup Pokemon. But if you really wanted to use Dustox, there is something for it to do. That being said, it's not a very good Pokemon, but I think I know the reason I like it, which is because I think it's actually quite useful during Nuzlocke of Pokemon Emerald. I'm pretty sure that's why I have some kind of attachment to the Pokemon. But if you want to use it in like an official competitive format, it's going to be tough. Now, unfortunately, I'm not done ragging on moth type Pokemon. I'm not done ragging on the moths yet, because as we get to number 7 on our list, it's time to talk about Mothim. Mothim looks pretty similar to Dustox in my opinion, like they're like at least in terms of a general outline, okay? I'm not saying whatever, who cares? Let's talk about the good things about Mothim first. I would say the typing is probably worse than Dustox. Bug and Flying gives you a quadruple weakness to Rock, which is not good. You don't want to have a lot of quadruple weaknesses. However, it does get a very good ability in Tinted Lens. Tinted Lens is a really good ability because basically what it says is if a Pokemon uses a not very effective move, double the power. So basically not very effective moves become neutral unless they're resisted by both your opponent's types, but for the most part, this is a huge power boost. This is especially good in a bug type Pokemon because bug is resisted by a ton of common types like fire and poison and steel and ghost. So having the ability to just like, hit them for big damage, even if they resist you is actually really good. And actually compared to a lot of the other Pokemon on this list, Mothim actually has better stats. It doesn't have good stats by any means. It's still pretty slow and pretty frail, very, very frail actually. 50 in both defenses is bad, but it has usable special attack and attack stats, and so it's like actually not that bad. Just like Dustox, it also gets access to those two same good moves in Quiver Dance and Tailwind, and the combination of Quiver Dance and Tinted Lens means that you could actually do some half decent damage if you gave it like a Life Orb and you set up a couple Quiver Dances. You might be able to eventually KO something. However, Mothim doesn't have good coverage moves, which is one of the big issues with it. It gets Quiver Dance, it gets Air Slash, it gets Bug Buzz, and like other than that, its move pool is pretty limited. It gets Energy Ball, Giga Drain, and that's like kind of it. So move pool is pretty lacking, although with Tinted Lens, this isn't as big of a deal. And I will say the other thing that you could do with it is you could use like a supporting set with not only Tailwind, but also Skill Swap, because Tinted Lens is a good ability, but Mothim isn't a very good user of it. So you could like set up Tailwind, then skill swap your Tinted Lens to a better Pokemon like Kyogre, for example. That being said, if you wanted to use a strategy, you would really just want to use Venomoth, who's kind of the same Pokemon but better. But that's not what we're talking about right now, okay? Anyway, the issue is that Mothim's stats are pretty bad for what it wants to do. Like with Dustox, you're actually like, you have better bulk. It's still not good, but you have slightly better bulk. So if you want to use Tailwind, like at least you have a higher chance of surviving. And with Dustox, you have a bug and poison typing, which is better than the bug and flying typings because you have more resistances and fewer like debilitating weaknesses. Mothim being so frail means that it's actually quite difficult for it to actually pull off this role. Like, of course, if your opponent gives you a bunch of free turns, you can do it, but like otherwise it's probably dying pretty quickly. So in the end, I decided that it was worse than Dustox because it's just what it can do, I think, is scarier, but having it actually pull it off is harder. And because of that, I thought that Mothim deserved a lower placement on my list. higher placement. I don't know. Anyway, that being said, we're still in the territory where there's something for the Pokemon to do, which with bug types, I was a little bit worried about. So even though it is a bad bug type, it's not the worst. All right, unfortunately, as we get to number 6 on the list, I'm not done ragging on the Wurmple line. Number 6 on my list is Beautifly. So I would say that Beautifly is somewhat of a combination between Dustox and Mothim. It has the typing of Mothim, which as we have just established is not very good. And similar to both Mothim and Dustox, it also gets Tailwind and Quiver Dance. And actually, I should specify that neither Dustox or Beautifly are in Scarlet and Violet, and while they did both get Tailwind in the Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon games and many games before that, as of Sword and Shield, they actually both lost Tailwind. So because we don't know exactly how things would be if they were in the current generation, I'm treating them as if they still have Tailwind, but that might actually not be accurate. So it's possible that these Pokemon should be even lower on the list, although frankly, the Pokemon still left to go are so bad that I think it doesn't really change all that much. Anyway, Beautifly is a better Quiver Dance user than Dustox. The reason for this is that while they are both pretty slow, Beautifly actually has a good special attacking stat. However, similar to Mothim, it has just abysmal defenses. Really, really, really low across the board. I don't know that much more to say about Beautifly because honestly, it's very similar to Mothim and Dustox, who I've already talked about. But the reason why it's lower than Dustox is because the typing is much worse and the bulk is much worse. And so having it actually stick around to do anything is a lot harder. I think I'm also docking it more points because there are actually many good bug and flying type Pokemon like Vivillon and Butterfree who can do a lot of similar things and have the same typing and don't have like a lot of the weaknesses that Beautifly has, or at least have more strengths, whereas there aren't as many good bug and poison types as well. So there's like more replacement for bug and flying types. And the reason why Beautifly is ranked lower than Mothim is because it doesn't get the Tinted Lens ability. In fact, both of its abilities are pretty worthless. It gets Swarm, which is like giving it a power boost when it's at low HP, but if it's at low HP, it's probably dead. And then Rivalry, which is in theory like a good ability because it gives you a 25% damage boost if you have the same gender as your opponent, but it will give you a 25% damage nerf if you have the opposite gender. And like, there's no way to guarantee which gender your opponent's Pokemon have. So this is literally just gambling unless you're using it for a specific threat, which is always one gender, like how Tornadus and Thundurus and Landorus are always male, and then Kangaskhan Mega is always, I guess all Kangaskhan's are always female. But like, what is Beautifly doing against Landorus Therian? You know what I mean? Also, somehow it seems that Beautifly has even worse coverage moves than like Mothim, which is crazy. So yeah, I actually really like Beautifly's design. I like the whole Wurmple line. I think it's a really cool Pokemon for a lot of reasons, but like this thing is not meant to be used in battle. You know, this is a Pokemon you have in your party and you box after you beat the second gym. You know what I mean? This is not a Pokemon that I think many people should be using in actual tournaments. I somehow am still not done talking about bug and flying type Pokemon because the number 5 Pokemon on our list is Vespiquen. Vespiquen. It's spelled Vespiquen, but it feels like it should be Vespiquen. I don't know. People are going to be yelling at me already. Okay, let's talk about some good things about Vespiquen because there are some good things about it. The biggest thing is the bulk. The bulk is actually pretty good. No, the bulk is actually regular good. I'm probably partially biased because I've been looking at Beautifly and Mothim stats recently, but like these are good defensive stats. They're probably not that good if I was comparing it to, you know, like Incineroar or Rillaboom, but like honestly, I will take it. These are good defensive stats. And actually compared to some of the other bug types, the offenses aren't the worst either. They're still very bad, okay? But they're very bad. They're not unusable, and there is a difference there. Unfortunately, it is also very slow. However, those are the good things. Wait, I have one more good thing. I like the shiny form. I think the shiny form looks kind of cool. Okay, bad things. First of all, Pressure is its starting ability, pretty worthless. And then it gets the Unnerve ability, and the Unnerve ability is good if you're a Pokemon that's like doing something offensively. But Vespiquen, the biggest issue with it is that it doesn't do anything. In fact, I would say the most threatening thing that Vespiquen can do is use Destiny Bond and try and get a KO that way. But of course, there's no reason for the opponent to attack Vespiquen because it doesn't do anything. So the abilities aren't very good. The stats are good defensively, but not very good offensive or speed wise. And then there's the moves. So I have a lot of things to say about the moves. First of all, Vespiquen has two signature moves called Attack Order and Defend Order. Attack Order is actually a pretty good move because it's a pretty like strong bug type move that has a high chance to crit. And Defend Order is kind of like Stockpile, so this is like a pretty decent move as well. But the thing is that it used to have a signature third move called Heal Order, which would heal it, which they removed, but they gave it Roost, which does effectively the same thing. I just don't get this. Like, why remove one of the signature moves and then give it a move that does effectively the same thing? I don't know. I really don't understand this. The bigger issue, however, is the fact that Vespiquen doesn't get very many good like moves that help the team. For example, despite being a flying type, it doesn't get Tailwind. Like Dustox gets Tailwind and it's not even a flying type, but Vespiquen, the flying type, no wind. And it's especially weird because Vespiquen actually learns a fair number of, I would say, decent moves in a vacuum that don't match one of its types. Like it gets Psychic Noise, it gets a bunch of poison moves like Toxic and Sludge Bomb, it gets the fighting move Reversal, it gets the rock move Power Gem, it gets Fury Swipes. Like, I don't know, I guess it does have hands, but like they're small, I don't know. Anyway, I think the move pool, like while there are some interesting moves, like it gets the fairy move Aromatic Mist, which gives the partner a special defense boost. Why? The issue is that although it has a bunch of kind of like interesting moves, it doesn't have like a good good moveset to run. Like you can run Toxic, you can run Destiny Bond, you can run Struggle Bug, but like these are all kind of like mid-tier moves that are good if you're supplementing a Pokemon that already has other good moves. But Vespiquen doesn't. I think it's a shame because like I do think this Pokemon has potential. In fact, out of everything that we've talked about thus far, I think Vespiquen is the most potential. Even if they just gave it Rage Powder, it would shoot up its viability a ton. Like giving it Rage Powder and Tailwind and having it have actually good bulk, especially when you can terrestrialize it, like this Pokemon could see some use. But the issue is because its move pool is so limited and because like it just doesn't have really anything going for it, it just doesn't have anything to do. And I think the big lesson that I've learned doing this series is that it's actually better for a Pokemon to be bad, but to have something it can do that's good, than for a Pokemon to be kind of okay, but have nothing like strong to do when it's on the field. Like Pokemon need to contribute in some way if they're coming to a battle, and Vespiquen just really struggles to do that. Okay, we're getting into really bad territory now, and our next Pokemon is a Pokemon that I think everybody expected to see on this list somewhere. It's Ariados. I'm gonna start by saying some good things about Ariados. I love the shiny. I especially love the way that the shiny looks in Scarlet and Violet. I don't know if it like is just the way that the model looks or whatever, but I think it looks really nice. Also, Bug and Poison, as I've talked about already twice on this list, it's not the worst typing. And I think I'm out of good things to say about Ariados. I'm sorry. Okay, the abilities. There's an ability that has some use. Ariados gets the ability Swarm, doesn't really do anything at Ariados, same thing as Vespiquen. He gets Sniper, which powers up critical hitting moves, which is, you know, good if you're a strong Pokemon. Ariados is not super useful. It does get Insomnia though, which prevents the Pokemon from falling asleep. And that's actually useful because we'll get to it in a second actually. So it has one usable ability, which is not terrible, okay? The stats are pretty bad. They're not the worst stats on the list, but the bulk is mediocre, not awful, but mediocre, and the attack is bad. The attack is really bad. Somehow not the worst on the list. There is one thing worth noting, which is that Ariados' moves are actually, I would say, okay. They're actually okay. Fun fact, this is not really relevant to the video, but I want to talk about it. Did you know that Ariados gets a signature move that it's the only Pokemon that learns called Toxic Thread? This move will poison one of your opponent's Pokemon and drop their speed stat. It's not very good, but I think it is cool that like it has a signature move in general, and it is like an interesting move that like on the right Pokemon could be good. The right Pokemon's not Ariados though, so like probably nobody knows about this move. Anyway, Ariados actually gets some moves that are worth talking about. The first is Sucker Punch, which lets it kind of overcome its low speed stat to like have a priority move. It's not that strong because Ariados is not a dark type, and so it's like not the best move, and it has low attack stat, but it's okay. It also gets Sticky Web, which is almost never seen in like the official competitive format, but like it is an interesting move that will cause all your opponent's Pokemon to lower their speed by 1 whenever they switch in. This normally isn't worth going through the trouble of setting up, but it is something. The real move that I think is worth talking about though, and the only thing saving Ariados from being kind of higher up on this list, is that it gets the move Rage Powder. Rage Powder forces your opponent's Pokemon to target the user instead of whatever they were aiming at. It actually has good synergy with Insomnia because you can redirect Spore, except you can't redirect Spore because Amoonguss is the main Spore Pokemon and grass types are immune to Rage Powder. So it's not actually that good. You can redirect Clefairy, Sing. Congratulations. Now, I would say that in a vacuum, Rage Powder is actually a bit more useful, especially on a Pokemon with bad defenses. I'm really trying to find a way to make these Pokemon do something. I really am, I promise. Here's the issue with Ariados in general, right? The single best thing you can do with it is use Rage Powder, and the problem is that like there are better Rage Powder users, but there are also better Follow Me Pokemon. In fact, both Electabuzz and Magmar get Follow Me, which is the better version of Rage Powder, and they also have the ability that prevents you from falling asleep. So like, it's just, there's nothing for Ariados to do. I'm really trying. Like, okay, it has something it can do. It can still click Rage Powder. It can click Sucker Punch. It gets Knockoff. It gets like Lunged and does it get Pounce? Oh man, it doesn't get Pounce. Oh man. I'm talking about Ariados enough, okay? It has something it can do. It's not very good. Moving on to the honorable mention. Okay, let's talk about some of the bug types that people thought were going to be on this list. Venomoth actually is a pretty decent Pokemon. It has the combination of Tinted Lens and Quiver Dance, plus it can do Tinted Lens plus Skill Swap plus Tailwind. Kind of a better version of Mothim. Yanmega, you already know that Yanmega is not going to be on this list. That Pokemon is goated. Fortress is bad enough that I thought about putting it on this list, but the stats are decent and it has enough that it could do that, like, given the quality of the other bug types, like Beedrill was 10th, and I thought Fortress is surely better than Beedrill. Masquerain is not a very good bug type Pokemon, but it does get Intimidate and Tailwind, and that was enough to keep it off the list. Illumise and Volbait actually see some play every once in a while because they are Prankster Tailwind users. Typically, they're worse than Whimsicott, but they have some kind of side grades that you could justify using them for. Leaveney is not a very good bug type. I kind of alluded to it earlier, but like, it has like actually a lot better stats than pretty much anything else on this list, and so yeah, I didn't think I could include it. Kind of similar with Galvantula. It's not a good bug type, but like Electric is a good secondary typing. It's pretty fast. Not going on the list. Vikavolt I kind of thought about putting on, but number one, it wasn't like bad enough. Like Vikavolt is definitely a good enough Pokemon that it doesn't deserve to be on this list, but also Charjabug has seen a little bit of use over the years, and since it's like part of the line, I thought yeah, like I can't put Vikavolt in the list. Frostmoth saw a little bit of play during early Sword and Shield as a Quiver Dance user, and also it's just not that bad. And then Pokemon like Rabsca and Beedrill actually have pretty decent stats overall, and so even though they're not great Pokemon, they are certainly more usable than like Beedrill and Mothim and Dustox. Anyway, let's talk about the top 3. The third worst bug-type Pokemon of all time is, unfortunately, Wormadam. Now, some of you might be surprised because I had Wormadam as the single worst grass-type Pokemon, and so like, of course, seeing it at number 3 here, that's a pretty big gap. However, here's the thing. Wormadam has 3 different forms, and only one of them is grass, but all 3 of them are bug. The grass one is really bad, but the ground one and the steel one are also really bad. But having 3 of them means it's slightly easier to justify using one of them at some point. Let me start by saying some good things about Wormadam. The ability Overcoat is actually quite good. It means that you are immune to powder moves like Spore and Rage Powder, so the ground and the steel one can still ignore Amoonguss, for example. Also, the bulk is not bad. It has a, well, it's not good. It's fine. The bulk is fine. I don't have a lot of good things to say about it, but I've been looking at some real stinkers and it's okay. I mean, it is worth noting that it changes based on the form, but they're all mediocre, all right? Here's the big problem though. All 3 of the Wormadam have a different attack and special attack stat, but the highest one out of any of them is 79. One of them has a 79 attack stat and one of them has a 79 special attack. That is not good. Like, that's really, really not good. And to make matters worse, it also has a very low speed stat. So the Wormadams all do get Quiver Dance, but like it really can't make good use of it. I don't know, maybe the steel one you could justify using, but even then it's not very good. The Wormadam is similar to many other Pokemon, just struggle because like there's nothing for them to do. You can Quiver Dance and that's kind of it. You have such low offenses that attacking with these Pokemon is not normally going to be worth it. And you also lack many of the good supporting moves that bug Pokemon sometimes get, like Rage Powder or even Tailwind. Other than the grass one, the ground and bug typing, and especially the bug and steel typing, is not that big of an issue. Like, bug and steel is actually really good typing because although both your Pokemon are weak to fire, you have no other weaknesses. Bug and ground is okay as well. But really the core issue is that these Pokemon don't get any moves that like can really help them to contribute to the battle in a meaningful way. Really, the best offensive move that they get is Infestation, which deals damage over time. However, it's not worth using these Pokemon just to click a move that does damage over time and will go away if you switch out or if you faint. Like, the pace is just too slow. Genuinely, your best odds of making a Wormadam work are to use the ground one because it learns Fissure and just click Fissure every turn. Other than that, it's like really not worth your time. And although I like Wormadam and I like Burmy, and I think from a design perspective, it's an awesome Pokemon, it's just not meant for battle. This is a Pokemon that's meant to be somebody's houseplant, okay? It's not meant to be going up against Primal Groudon. Okay, we are really, really scraping the bottom of the barrel now. Like, these are Pokemon that are just so difficult to use. And so the second worst bug type Pokemon of all time is Kricketune. It's iconic. I know people love Kricketune. I like Kricketune. The cry is just awesome, right? I think the cry alone makes it like a Pokemon that people feel fondly about. Using it is bad. Using it is really rough. It's a pure bug type, which honestly isn't the worst. Probably better to be a pure bug than a bug and flying type. And that's kind of the only good thing I can say about Kricketune, okay? Abilities, somewhat worthless. Like, it has Swarm. We've already talked about Swarm is not good. Technician is okay. It powers up weak moves to make them like fine, like average moves. Doesn't do enough to justify using Kricketune. The stats are probably the biggest issue. No, the stats are the second biggest issue. They're bad. Like, the attack stat is better than some of the other bugs on the list, but the bulk is bad, it's slow, and it doesn't hit very hard. As a pure bug type Pokemon, it really needs some help if it wants to do like things offensively. And between the low attack stat and the very limited supporting move pool, like its best coverage moves are like Brick Break and Throat Chop, which are not very good. And pretty much everything else doesn't do very much damage at all. And it also gets no good supporting moves. No Rage Powder, no Tailwind, no Fake Out, no Follow Me. There's nothing for this Pokemon to do. However, the reason why it's number 2 and not number 1 is that there is one move that Kricketune learns that could justify it being used if you are a very specific person and you have a very limited metagame. And that's what I'm going to say about that, because Kricketune is one of the only Pokemon in the game to learn Perish Song. Perish Song is a very limited move in distribution, and the fact that Kricketune learns it means that while it's not a very good Pokemon, there is one very hyper-specific niche. Like, imagine a rule set where Kricketune is the only Perish Song user. It's not likely, and it still would probably mean that Perish Song just like shouldn't be used. Perish Trap just is a strategy that shouldn't be used. However, when I was going between number 2 and number 1, this was the difference maker. Kricketune learns Perish Song. I will say that like I would not be surprised if Kricketune got like a Mega Evolution or a regular evolution or like a regional, probably not a regional form. But, like, this is a Pokemon that's quite popular and like they could give an evolution to without having to worry about the pre-evolution becoming too strong with Eviolite. So I don't know. I hope that it gets some love at some point. I kind of have a feeling it will. It's like so popular. Surely it'll get some love at some point, right? But for now, it's going at the second worst bug type Pokemon of all time, which is, I think, not a very hot take. The single worst bug type Pokemon of all time is Ledyba. Listen, Ledyba has a lot of problems, okay? But there is one that makes the rest of them kind of just completely obsolete. which is the stats. While the special defense stat is actually pretty good for this list and the speed stat is not bad at all, Ledyen's attack stat is 35, and its special attack is barely better at 55. I'm gonna sound like a broken record at this point, but like a big part of what makes a Pokemon bad is if it comes to a battle and can't contribute anything to that battle. And with offensive stats this low, there is truly nothing for Ledyen to do. Like many of the other bug types that have shown up at the bottom of this list, it just doesn't get good supporting moves. It can use Tailwind, but frankly, Tailwind is not a move that has like all that poor distribution. Lots of Pokemon learn it. And after setting up Tailwind, what are you gonna do with Ledyen? Are you gonna use Mach Punch? Are you gonna use Double Edge? Like seriously, what are you gonna do with this thing? Ledyen really feels like the subject of a mean practical joke, at least to me, which is a shame because I really like the design. I think it's a really cool looking Pokemon. But the reason why it feels like this is just a joke Pokemon that Game Freak is making fun of is because of the abilities. Like many bug types, it gets Swarm. It also gets Early Bird, which is like just a worse version of Insomnia, which is kind of mean, but whatever. But the real thing is that they gave it a hidden ability, which in theory is a chance to kind of give it another shot at life, right? Hidden abilities weren't added until Generation 5. And so in theory, they could have given Ledyen a really good ability, like Wonder Guard. No, just kidding. But they could have given it something, I don't know, like actually useful, right? That would give it something to do. And instead of that, they gave it the move Iron Fist, which powers up all punching moves by 20%. Now, every single punching move is a physical attack, literally every single one. So Ledyen is forced to get this 20% power boost on its abysmal, unthinkably low physical attack stat, and also there isn't a single bug or flying type punching move. So it isn't even able to get this boost on moves that it shares a typing with. Ledyen is so bad that at some point they have to do something for it. Like at some point they have to give it an evolution or a mega evolution or something, right? They have to rework its stats. Something has to change with this Pokemon because it is just so incredibly unthinkably bad. But until that happens, it is undoubtedly the single worst bug type Pokemon of all time. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you should check out the one I made on the worst grass type Pokemon. Grass type Pokemon are a bit better across the board, so that list was a bit harder to make. I think it's a pretty interesting video. You should go check it out.